Admiral McRaven retired as a four-star admiral and went on to become the chancellor of the University of Texas system. During his 37 years in the military, he commanded special operations forces at every level, closing his career by being in charge of all U.S. special operations. His career included Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. You know him for commanding the troops that captured Saddam Hussein, for rescuing Captain Phillips, if you saw the movie, and he was credited with developing the plan and leading the Osama bin Laden mission. He's written 3 books. His book, Make Your Bed, which was predicated on a speech that he gave at the University of Texas. Today, if you get your New York Times, will enjoy its 71st week on the New York Times bestseller list. His book, Sea Stories, which is the main thing we're going to talk about today, My Life in Special Operations, was also a major New York Times bestseller. And when I read the first draft, I called him and I said, very seldom does one of my authors invent a new genre. Admiral McRaven invented a new genre. I call it the thriller memoir. Because memoirs aren't usually thrillers, and thrillers aren't usually memoirs. I'd like to start, Admiral, with San Antonio, 1967, and ask you, please, how your Roy Rogers pearl-handled 6-shooter taught you lessons about parental wisdom and discipline and risk.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bob. First, thanks for taking the time to do this. Can you all hear me out there? Before I begin, though, I did want to just take a solemn minute to say and to pass on my condolences for all those that were, killed in the tragic shootings over the weekend. I know we say this too many times, but we have got to do something about this. I'm not sure I know the answer, but this just can't keep going on. To your question, so I was raised, as I mentioned yesterday, my father was an Air Force officer. We lived in France when I was very young, and then we moved to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. And growing up there as a kid in San Antonio at Lackland Air Force Base from about 8 to 11, there was an ammunition storage depot that was in proximity to the small base we lived on. And, of course, this was the time of James Bond and I Spy and the Man from U.N.C.L.E. And so growing up as a kid, these were the sort of guys, along with cowboys and Indians from Texas, that we loved to emulate. Well, one day, a couple of friends and I thought it would be a really good idea to break into the ammunition storage depot and do a James Bond-like mission. I was 10 years old, so, cut me a little slack here. But so we made our way down through this gully, and it was a kind of a 3-fence setup. And we were each kind of armed to the teeth. A friend of mine had his Red Ryder BB gun. Another guy had the Fess Parker long musket. And I had my Roy Rogers kind of pearl-handled cap gun. Well, as we kind of get to the fence line, I managed to scale over the first fence. My buddies decided this was not such a good idea at the time. But I made my way to the second fence, scaling over the second fence, and then all hell broke loose. The military police start coming. I make my way back over the second fence. I run to the first fence. I make my way back over the first fence. But in doing so, I dropped my Roy Rogers pearl-handle pistol. Well, I make my way back into the woods, and we finally kind of get back home, and things seem to die down. And I'm thinking, wow, we got through this. So we make our way back up at the base housing, and that was a Saturday, and Saturday goes by and nothing happens, and Sunday goes by and nothing happens. And on Monday, my dad gets home from work, and he calls me into the living room, and he says, hey, Bill, I just heard from the military police that some kids tried to break into the ammunition storage depot. And as I said in the book, for the first and last time in my life, I lied to my father when he said, do you know anything about this? And I looked him in the eye and said, no, sir, I don't. And he said, okay. And, kissed me goodnight. I went in, took my shower, got into bed, and there on my nightstand was my Roy Rogers pearl-handle pistol. Over the course of the next 50 some odd years when my dad was still alive, never once did he mention it. And for 52 years, I've worried about that damn Roy Rogers Pro-handle pistol. So there was some good parenting involved there.
Absolutely. Now I'd like to move to another adventure, which is, I think, my favorite in the whole book, Admiral. Coronado, California, September 1989. This adventure starts with a message to you from the President of the United States. And it reads, the President of the United States requests your assistance in locating a Navy PAV reconnaissance plane that was lost in British Columbia, Canada in 1948. You found it, and it probably resulted in one of the spookier incidents ever.
So I was the executive officer at SEAL Team 1. So on the East Coast, we break our SEAL teams down into, we had 3 teams back then. And because this plane was thought to have gone down at high altitude and maybe crashed in a lake at high altitude, the president, through the chairman of the Joint Chief, sent out a message requesting that the SEALs go in and dive in this high altitude lake to hopefully find this airplane. Well, to make a long story short, myself and 4 other guys, we went up to near Tofino, British Columbia. We had to catch a small helicopter out to this really outback. And this area we were in was what appeared to be kind of an extinct volcano. So this was in September, and the snow had melted around 3/4, but there was a long kind of ice tunnel that went from the lake, which was at the bottom of the volcano, which dropped off into another part of the terrain, and then this kind of high arcing tunnel. Well, as we kind of get settled in, it's clear to me that there is no plane here, and unless the plane's in the lake, we're probably not going to find it. And there were kind of 2 stories that went along with this, 2, if you will, kind of ghost stories. But the one that I think Bob is referring to is, in the course of the expedition, we actually end up finding the plane buried underneath this ice tunnel. And as we broke into the ice tunnel, it was actually hollow on the inside. And we made our way up to the ice tunnel, and there, in about 1 million pieces, was the outline of this P-2V. And unfortunately, of course, we had lost 9 airmen, naval aviators, in that crash, and they had apparently lost power, thought the lake was probably a clear area, and crashed into the side of the hill. We were actually able to recover a couple of small bone fragments and some other artifacts from the wreck. And while we were there on site, I brought some of the family members in, and we decided to do a little ceremony to pay our respects to the fallen. So we buried the bone fragments, put up a cross, and I said a few words. And then, at about that time, within a minute or 2 of saying a few words, one of my SEALs turns to me and he says, "Hey, sir, what's that?" And again, we're in this kind of volcano-ringed area, and high up on the edge of the cliff, I saw what appeared to be a military parachute flare. This was broad daylight. It's very bright, shining. It's kind of hanging up there. And I said, I looked around. I thought, what's a parachute flare? We're out in the middle of nowhere. And then there was a second, and a third, and a fourth, and a 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. And finally, one of the guys turns to me and he says, "Hey, sir, how many of those do you see?" And there were 9 of them. And there were 9 of these glowing orbs, if you will, hovering over the ridge for about 15 minutes. And then one by one, they headed up. Now, I'm quick to tell people I don't believe in ghost stories, and I'm sure there was a logical explanation for this, but to this day, I have no idea why these 9 shining orbs were there just as we had buried these fine naval aviators. So,
and you write in the book, a local said, "My ancestors believe that the remains of the dead must be visible to heaven so their souls can be guided through the dome." Read the last sentence.
Yeah, so as I was getting on the helicopter on the way back, the helicopter pilot we had on headphones, and as Bob said, he said that. And so I said, sitting back on the floorboard, I watched as the ice floes disappeared into the distance, the thumping of the rotor blades marking our progress back to Tofino. I looked skyward, smiled, and rendered a salute. The crew was finally home.
Now I'd like to move to October of 1990 aboard the amphibious ship USS Ogden in the Indian Ocean. Your wonderful wife, Georgianne, is here. Please welcome Georgianne, everybody. You spent 37 years in the military, and a whole lot of that, I can't even imagine what percentage was away from your family. Afghanistan, Iraq, all over the world. And you write movingly about leaving that day. And you write, 5 months earlier, I'd left my wife, Georgiana, my two boys, Bill and John, on the pier in San Diego as the USS Okinawa pulled away for a routine 6-month deployment. There are few things more gut-wrenching than watching your family slow disappear into the distance as your ship sails out of port. While I love being a SEAL, there was nothing in the world more important to me than my family. How do you live with that? How do you live with that incredible years, months, years at a time of separation from what I know to be a wonderful family?
Well, first, you know, you have to be lucky enough to marry the right woman in my case. And that is in and of itself a story. We've been married almost 42 years. And when I look back on my career, there is no doubt in my mind I would not have made it past ensign had it not been for Georgianne and her ability to kind of take care of the family while I was gone. And that, absolutely. And that was always reassuring to me. You know, you have a job to do in the military. You know when you sign up for the military that there are going to be these long deployments. But to your point, Bob, and what may not be mentioned in there was Georgianne was pregnant at the time. We had expected that this was going to be a 6-month deployment and that I would be back in time for the delivery. And, of course, as it turned out, we went on a routine deployment that turned into Desert Shield and Desert Storm. I didn't get back for 10 months. I came back and had a brand-new bouncing baby girl. So,
many things in this book inspired me. Many things educated me. But one thing really surprised me, because I know you a bit, because we work together a lot, and I know you to be a man of peace. But you wrote the following, which I'd love you to comment on and explain to these folks. As terrible as it sounds, every SEAL wants to go to war. War validates your manhood. It reaffirms your courage. It sets you apart from the timid souls and the beach sitters. Sorry. It builds unbreakable bonds among your fellow warriors. It gives your life meaning. But somehow, inexplicably, war never loses its allure. To the warrior, peace has no memories, no milestones, no adventures, no heroic death, no gut-wrenching sorrow, no jubilation, no remorse, no repentance, and no salvation. Peace was meant for some people, but probably not for me. Now, that seems to me so counterintuitive from the man I know. Please explain.
yeah, and I debated long and hard whether to put this in the book, candidly. And Georgianne advised me against it. It's probably the first time in my life I have not taken her advice. And I may end up regretting it. But I thought it was important that, frankly, the public and people reading it, I also didn't want to be disingenuous. The fact of the matter is, when you join the military, you join it to be a warrior. And you hope that by being a warrior, you are doing something that is noble, that is honorable, that is protecting the American people. I mean, that is your hope and your expectation. If at any point in time you find that the work you're doing is not noble and honorable and supporting the American people, you need to step aside. But up to that point in time, you want to be the best warrior you can be. And that is, again, that is awkward and uncomfortable at times when you tell people that, yes, I want to be the best shot around so that I can kill people that are trying to harm American citizens. And as much as, again, I hated to leave my family, we often talk about my time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and sometimes it's easy to get nostalgic and to say, oh, I remember those days, except sometimes you remember those days and the feeling in the pit of your stomach is just overwhelming. But at the end of the day, you think you're doing something good. And if you think you're doing something good, you want to be the very best at it. And that was what I was trying to bring out in that.
Thank you. Thank you. You spoke movingly yesterday in the memoir panel with George about your accident, and so I won't get into that in detail, but I would like to ask you a question about it. For those of you who weren't there, turn your attention to San Diego, California in 2001, and the Admiral was in a terrible parachute accident. I will just read you what the doctor said. Your pelvis is separated by about 5 inches. All of the muscles in your abdomen and legs have been separated from the bone, and your back is slightly fractured. No big deal, I laughed. You'll be fine. Tell us, please, how you come back from something like that.
Yeah, and as I mentioned yesterday, the point of the story wasn't so much about the events of my parachute accident as it was about the fact that once I had the accident, so very many people, got around me to make me well again. Because when I look at the incredible and the horrific injuries from Iraq and Afghanistan, this barely counted. But in this case, again, being young, I was probably 45 at the time, relatively young, and the nature of the work was always risky. In the course of my career, I crashed in a helicopter, in a parachute, in a boat. You were always finding yourself, near death. Something just at 1 second, you were almost dead. The next second you weren't, and you went, okay, well, back to work. You had to have that sort of attitude, or you were not going to be able to make it in the teams. It is just the necessity of the job. So when I got hurt, there was, as long as I realized there wasn't any spinal damage, and I think I mentioned it in the book, I got a little fixated. Again, the trauma causes you to be fixated, that I could wiggle my toes. So while I couldn't move, I couldn't sit up, I could wiggle my toes, which meant I knew my spine was okay. And then I realized, hey, it's just a matter of time. I am going to figure out a way to get back on the horse and continue to be a SEAL. But it did take a lot of people to get me there. The Admiral Eric Olson, who was my boss, managed to find a way to keep me in the Navy, and that was not easy considering the extent of my injuries. But I find the kids today, and again, it is remarkable when you see these young men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan who have lost arms and legs, are blast victims, are blind, and the first thing they want to know is, when can I get back to my unit? When can I get back to my unit? That is the bond. Back to the earlier paragraph. It's hard to explain, but I see a couple of veterans here in the audience. You understand this bond amongst your fellow soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines is remarkably strong. And when you have an accident like this, when you have a tragedy, interestingly enough, your first thought is, how do I get back to help my fellow comrades?
That deserves applause, folks. Now, those of you who flew here, who aren't clear or TSA PreCheck, know about taking your shoes off, know about putting your laptop. Yes, I am. This is the man who is responsible for that. And I want to read from the book. And then I said words I would regret for the rest of my traveling days. Sir, I think we need to have everyone boarding a plane bound for the U.S. take their shoes off and have them inspected. Also, we need security to check every laptop. How did you become the author of us being through security check?
Well, I'm quick to say I'm sure the President of the United States made the final decision. But in this case, I was working in the White House. This was after 9/11. And for those of you that might remember Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, so I'm in the White House. I get a call from the Situation Room. You got to come down to the sit room fast. The president and my boss, a retired four-star general, were up on Air Force One, and we had just gotten word that Richard Reed had been kind of captured on the plane and had this shoe bomb. Well, being a demolition guy, I went down. I had the schematics of the shoe bomb, and I looked at it and I thought, I don't think this thing would really work. Knowing how you have to have a primer, knowing how the demolition has to work, I didn't think the shoe bomb was going to work. Well, I call up the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and the guy that picks up the phone is a friend of mine who is an explosive ordnance disposal guy named Ed Cattell. So I'm talking to Ed, who I haven't seen in years, and I said, Ed, look, I'm looking at this. What do you think? And he goes, oh, yeah, it would have worked. Golly. So I have to pick up the phone. I get a hold of my boss, from ground-to-air communications. He's on Air Force One. The comms aren't very good. He drops a few F-bombs. He had to know my boss. And I said, hey, sir, I really think that we're going to have people's shoes checked. There could be, again, hard to imagine it now, but we didn't know whether or not there were more Richard Reeds out there. Was this a large al-Qaeda conspiracy? Were there going to be more planes that were hit? And when we thought about the laptop, again, being demo guys, we realized the battery in a laptop could initiate some demolition. So I reached out to my boss and said, hey, we probably need to do this. And my understanding was he was on the plane with the president. They agreed. Some committee, I'm sure, was formed, so I'm not going to take all the blame on it. But I did probably get the ball rolling on it.
The rest is history.
So my apology. I only thought it was going to last a couple months, by the way.
How many of you seen the movie of Captain Phillips? You write movingly about that adventure, and at one point you recount the last moments. Sniper 1, target 1, green. Sniper 2, target 2, green. Sniper 3, target 3, deep breath, good sighting picture, green. Execute, execute, execute. How in the world did those snipers on bobbing seas in small boats shoot those 3 pirates?
Yeah, so one, very good shots, needless to say. But the coordination, I mean, when I think back on the complexity of this, that they not only shot the pirates, they had to shoot through portholes, so everything had to line up just perfectly. Now, it wasn't a terribly long shot, but for those of you that are riflemen, you understand, you've got to get the bad guy or the target right in the X. You've got to have a right. Everybody has to hit it simultaneously, because had they hit one of the pirates and not the other ones, then Captain Phillips probably was going to be dead. So part of my responsibility was to really kind of pass the command down to the lowest possible level to make sure that there was a young Navy lieutenant commander who was on that fantail, who had 3 enlisted guys that were the snipers, and it was really going to be his job to make the assessment when to make the call. And as the small lifeboat got closer and closer, again, I couldn't manage this. I was actually in Afghanistan, hard to believe, but the technology was good enough that I could see everything that was going on. We had a scan eagle, we had full motion video, but this young kid and the 3 snipers made that final decision right when everything lined up. And again, kind of a 1 in a million shot in light of the fact that it was 3 targets, 3 portholes simultaneously, and again, saved Captain Phillips as a result.
Yep. Realizing that the commander-in-chief has ultimate authority in war, but you're the one who's ordering the missions, and you're the one who's approving the missions, and you're the one who's sending these young men and women onto these missions. And the responsibility that you bear is inconceivable to me. My war stories consist of going to the draft board in Waukegan, Illinois, and getting my 1Y. So I'm hardly a military veteran. But you write, over the 3 years, the task force would capture or kill more than 2,000 medium or high value individuals each year. Individuals who are threats to our forces. In the course of those operations, more than 300 of our special operations soldiers would lose their lives, and thousands were injured, some never to live a normal life. Not a day goes by that I don't reflect on the sacrifices of those men and women. It's easy to judge the wars today and say they clearly did not deliver the peace or the change we'd hoped for. But how many Americans or our allies would have died in embassies and airplanes and towers and subways and hotels or on the streets if we hadn't eliminated terrorists or the countless others who are plotting against us? How do you make those decisions? They are truly life and death decisions. What strength does one have that allows one to analyze these situations and say, okay, it's a go, I'm putting these young lives at risk?
Yeah, I'll tell another little story that I think will illustrate this. So in the summer of 2010, President Obama had already made the decision that we were going to pull out of Iraq in early 2011. And I went down to meet with my guys in Baghdad and kind of having an all-hands call, like a little town hall meeting with the operators. And they were going out every night on missions. And one senior chief petty officer, fairly high enlisted SEAL, at one point in time said, "Admiral, WTF, why are we still doing this? We're about to leave in 6 months, and every night you're putting our lives on the line. Why? We're just going to leave." And, I knew this question was going to arise at some point in time. And the only answer I could provide to this senior enlisted guy was the fact that, look, you're going to go out and you are not going to know the cascading effect that your actions will have. And for those of you that have kind of studied history, and I love to tell the story about the Japanese ace who had, 25, 30 kills. He's in the Pacific Ocean. He's flying. He sees an American transport plane. The transport plane kind of comes into view. He's about to shoot down this transport plane and then looks down, realizes he's out of fuel, decides to break away, and does not shoot down that transport plane. And on that transport plane was a young Navy lieutenant commander named Lyndon Baines Johnson. And the point I made to the senior enlisted guy was, you have no idea. Tonight you're going to go out and you're going to break up an al-Qaeda ring that's about to drive a vehicle-borne IED into a market in Baghdad. And that bomb could kill 50 to 100 people. You have no idea who those 50 to 100 people are. One of those persons could be the scientist that cures cancer, or their child, or their grandchild, or their great-grandchild, or their great-great-great-grandchild. So my point to them was, do your job. You have to go out every day. If you overthink it, you'll never get around to doing it. And part of my responsibility was to do my job. And the American people had called on me, had hired me. The president had faith and confidence in me that we would get out and do our job. And at the time, our job was to defend the Iraqi people against the al-Qaeda scourge, and to do the best we could to protect our Americans and our allies. That was our job. And so when I looked at sending people into harm's way, you have to think about it in the long term. And again, I'm not sure I can assess. You know, right now when you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, it is easy, as I say in the book, to look back and say, well, maybe we weren't successful. Maybe this was a disaster. But what you don't know is, how many young girls in Afghanistan have we saved? How many of those young girls will be like Malala and go on to win a Nobel Prize in peace and bring their country around? I don't know. I don't know. What I know is I got to do my job, and my guys got to do their job, and that's what motivates us.
When those young lives are lost, we often hear the saying, they knew what they signed up for. I'm sure we've all heard that. And you write, I have learned many times over that those who serve do so with their eyes open. They overcome their doubts and concerns because they're inspired by their fellow soldiers. Those who serve are serving their hometowns, their high school football teams, their girlfriends and their boyfriends. They're serving and sacrificing because they believe in America they grew up in. Talk about whether the eyes open is true in your experience, whether it's universal, and how you can explain it.
Yeah, probably not surprisingly, the young men and women that sign up, they sign up for a whole lot of reasons. Part of this is they do want to do something for their country. They want to be part of something bigger than themselves. But I think when they internalize it, at least I know when I internalize it, it is more localized. It really is about the fact that they feel like they are protecting, the guys and gals they went to high school with, or the ice cream shop on the corner of their small town, or where they got a Philly cheesesteak. I mean, it is internalized in that it is who they are. It is the culture that they were raised in that they want to protect. Now, conversely, I can tell you, having worked with soldiers from a whole bunch of different countries, they all feel the same way. This is this recognition that they are there to protect their people, their culture, their way of life. In one of the New York Times, by the book, or in the book, whatever the small thing was, they asked me what one of my favorite books was, and I said it was All Quiet on the Western Front. And the reason All Quiet on the Western Front resonated with me is it was about World War I, and it was written from a German soldier's perspective in World War I, which is exactly what my perspective would have been in Iraq and Afghanistan. And you realize that the soldiers are all the same. And the reason that's a cautionary note is that you have to realize when you go to war, the other people are probably thinking the same thing you are. And you better do everything you can to prevent going to war. But if you decide to go, you better be ready, because the other side's going to be just as fired up as you are.
Now I'm going to do the unthinkable. I'm going to do a lightning round with a 4-star admiral, and even touch on some politics. You served how many commanders-in-chief?
Starting from Nixon, I guess.
Yeah, so a lot. Yeah. And we have a particular commander-in-chief now. Does the character and morality of a commander-in-chief matter to the troops?
Absolutely. And here's what I can tell. I worked in Bush 43 administration. I was in the White House then, and then obviously one of President Obama's commanders. And I can tell you, I didn't agree with every president, every man on every decision they made. In fact, some of them I kind of violently disagreed with them. Having said that, they were both men of great character and integrity. And whether you agreed with their politics or not, they thought they were doing what was right for the country. And when you see that, and when you experience that, that is easy to follow. When you believe that it is about, something other than them, then as a soldier, that's easy. You can follow that. When you think it is about themselves or something other than what is good for the country, it becomes very, very challenging.
When President Trump pulled John Brennan's ticket, you voluntarily, in an act of, got a lot of attention, surrendered your security clearance. What was your thinking behind that?
Well, there is kind of this unwritten rule, and appropriately so, that senior officers, don't say bad things about the commander-in-chief. And I think that is an appropriate unwritten rule. And I knew when I made this comment that I would be violating that particular rule. But I also have known John Brennan for a long time. Frankly, whether you agree with John or not, this is a man who has served 8 different presidents, a career public servant who has probably given more than most I know to this country. And as a private citizen, he certainly has the right to speak his mind. And for the President of the United States to essentially threaten John Brennan with pulling his security clearance struck me as woefully inappropriate. And so, frankly, John's a friend. I take my friendships very seriously, and realizing that this would probably create a stir and that I would get a lot of backlash. But I got to wake up and look myself in the mirror. And some things you just say, this is a line that I thought the president had crossed, and it needed to be addressed.
I think many admired that. Some 30-second answers. What is the future of women in the military?
Yeah, well, the future's bright, and actually the future, women in the military have their ability to continue to contribute has been really for the past probably 4 or 5 decades that I watched it. So they're looking at combat positions. There are just some things that, frankly, women are much better at than we are as men. I think they are welcomed into the institution, and I would encourage any young lady that's interested in going into the military to sign up.
And what is the future of LGBT in the military?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. Again, in the military, we just don't care what your gender is, what your orientation is, what your ethnicity is. Just do your job. I mean, that's the bottom line. Come in and do your job.
You are not only a great commander, you are a student of military history. Who is your favorite military hero?
Yeah, this is going to sound a little trite, but it's George Washington. If you look back on the history of, you can pull up any military leader, and at some point in time, you find somebody that has written something derogatory about him. It's really, really, really hard to find something derogatory about George Washington as a military leader. Now, got it? He owned slaves. Certainly that is something that has to be addressed, but as a military leader, and as a president who early on said, I'm not going to run again, I'm not going to take on the title king. I mean, these are some remarkable attributes for a man. And so when I think of military leaders, Washington's at the top.
How about your most admired political leader? That puts you on the spot, I know.
Yeah, it does. This again, some of this is going to sound a little self-serving. I talk about Saddam Hussein in the book, and I said when we captured Saddam Hussein, it was interesting. I held on to him for about 30 days, and I watched when he no longer had his generals and he no longer had his palace and no longer had his handmaidens. He just became a pathetic old man. And I had him for 30 days, and this happened within a week. You think about Nelson Mandela, who was incarcerated for 3 decades. And because this was a man of incredible strength, incredible character, he was able to withstand this long incarceration and then come out and do the best he could to abolish apartheid and bring that country together. That is pretty doggone remarkable. So I'd have to put him right at the top.
Make Your Bed, and to some degree Sea Stories, is about SEAL training. And again, with a total absence of military background, I was amazed by the stories you told in Make Your Bed. What is the one most important lesson you learned from SEAL training?
Yeah, I'm often asked by young aspiring SEALs, what does it take to get through training? And I told the story about this young kid who was a nationally ranked decathlete at the University of Texas, had lunch with me one day, and he said, "Sir, what do I need to do to get through SEAL training?" He said, do I need to, do I need to do more pull-ups? I mean, the kid's 6'4", he's got shoulders like this at 14-inch waist. I said, no. He said, do I need to run more? No. Do I need to swim more? No. What's the secret sauce? What do I need to do? I said, you just don't quit. And he said, no, I got that. No, I don't think you do. I said, it isn't about the fastest or the strongest it is about the guy that doesn't quit. And the reason that's important is because it's not about the 6 months of SEAL training. It's about the rest of your career, and you will have so many opportunities in the rest of your career to quit when you're at 9,000 feet in the Hindu Kush, to quit when one of your buddies has been killed, to quit when you're deploying time and time again. It is about life. And so the one lesson from Make Your Bed for everybody is we're all going to have those challenging times. You just don't quit.
I've had the great honor in my career of representing a lot of 4-stars. Nicholson, Petraeus, Mullen, you, McChrystal, Crow. What the military is this huge bureaucracy and people. What makes a 4-star? Don't talk about yourself, because that I know you're not like that. What makes a 4-star? How do you get to be a 4-star? There are only what? How many are there now? It's like 60 maybe or something. How through this hundreds of thousands of people do you become a 4-star?
Yeah, it's all about the troops. The troops make you a 4-star. And by that, if you can't earn the respect of the troops, then you're never going to get into a leadership position time and time and time again. Now, you may the first time, and you may fool some people, but the troops know whether or not you're a leader. It is the young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines whose respect you have to earn by taking risks, by showing that you support them, by maintaining good order and discipline, by having a good unit. You have to do all the great things that they expect a great leader to do in order for you to continue to promote. So when you look at the Mike Mullins and the Dave Petraeus and the Stan McChrystals and the Admiral Crows, it is because the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines are the ones that made them successful. They knew that. They knew that they had to take care of the troops in order to get things done.
In the last 48 hours, we've read a lot about Admiral Green's letter calling to account some, let us call it, misconduct in SEALs. Can you tell the audience sort of what that's about, and without second guessing, because I know this is not your way, what you would suggest be done about it? Because it strikes me reading about it as a pretty serious problem.
Yeah. So what Bob's referring to is Admiral Colin Green, the head of Naval Special Warfare, essentially all the SEALs, sent out a letter to his commanders to say, we got a problem. Because in the past couple of years, actually, you've had this kind of series of bad behaviors on the part of the SEALs. You had the high-profile Ed Gallagher case, but then you've had SEALs drinking in Syria, and so this is a problem. And I commend Admiral Green for doing exactly what he did. And the way we handle things in the military is there are no excuses. So this isn't, we have a problem, let's find all the reasons why we have this problem. The answer is we're going to fix the problem. And the only way you fix the problem is to get after it, is to say, we got it, let's figure out how we improve it, and we're not going to make any excuses to people. We're not going to complain about, what happened here and what happened there. We're just going to get after it. So I commend Admiral Green for addressing the problem, for aggressively going after it, because it is an existential problem for us. If the American public and if the Commander-in-Chief lose their respect for the way we do business, then we'll be out of business, and that won't serve the American people well.
You have a lot of souvenirs that you've gained over your military career. My favorite, which you write about in the book, is a mounted tape measure. Please tell us why you have a mounted tape measure on your wall.
So as the bin Laden raid was finishing up, I'm in Afghanistan on a video teleconference with the president and the national security team. And the president asked me, he says, well, do you know for certain whether it's bin Laden? I said, no, sir, I don't. I need to kind of go personally ID the body. The helos were just crossing the border, coming back into the little air base, which was nearby. And so I said, give me a few minutes, and I'll go check out the body. So I went over to the airfield. The SEALs had just come in. They take the body bag, a rubberized body bag, off the truck and lay it down on the floor of the hangar. So I got down, and I unzipped the body bag, and without getting too graphic, needless to say, bin Laden didn't look too well. He had a couple of rounds. But I removed the remains, and I knew bin Laden was about 6'4". Now, I'm 6'2", and I thought about lying next to the body, but I thought that would be probably a little inappropriate. So I saw some young SEAL standing nearby. I said, hey, son, how tall are you? He said, well, sir, I'm 6'2". I said, good, come here. So I had this young kid lay down. First, he looks at me. I said, hey, I need you to lie down. He goes, what? But he quickly figured out what I was trying to do. So he laid down next to the remains. Remains were a couple inches longer. So I go back to the video, and I'm on the video with the president. He says, well, what do you think? And I said, well, sir, I said, we still need to do some DNA, but pretty sure it's him. And I said, no, by the way, I had a young SEAL lie down next to him, and the remains were a couple inches longer. Well, there was this pause on the other end of the video. And, of course, we had lost the helicopter on the target. And he said, okay, let me get this straight. He said, we had $65 million for a helicopter, and you didn't have $10 for a tape measure? And it had been one of those, tense moments, and it was, the timing was exactly right to kind of, for that night, again, recognizing the seriousness of the event. Well, about a day or so later, I go back to Washington, D.C. I'm testifying before Congress, and I get a call that the president wants to see me over in the Oval Office. So I go over to the Oval Office, and I'm with my small team. The president says thanks and congratulations. And he says, oh, by the way, I got something for you. And he reaches around behind his desk and pulls out this plaque. And on the plaque it says, from the President of the United States to Vice Admiral Bill McRaven, if we have $65 million for a helicopter, I think we have $10 for a tape measure. Next time, take the tape measure. And it's got a tape measure on the plaque. So.
Before we go to question and answer, I'd like to do one last thing. All of us have had big moments in our lives. Maybe if we coach a team, we stir the troops, the players to go into the finals of the championship, or maybe if we're lawyers and we have a group going into trial, we try to inspire them. I'd like to ask the Admiral to read what he said to the troops before they went after Osama bin Laden.
Yeah, so this was, we do a final briefing where we bring everybody that's involved in the mission, which was probably about the number of folks that are in this room concerning helicopter pilots and support. So we're in a big hangar, and at the end of the briefing, I stood up from my folding chair and faced the gathering of SEALs and the helo crews. Said, I think most of you know I'm a basketball fan. Some in the crowd smiled, having played pickup ball with me on several occasions. I said, there's this great scene in the movie Hoosiers. I said, waiting for a second for it to sink in. Hoosiers is the story of a small-town basketball team in Indiana that reaches the high school state championship in 1955. They traveled to Indianapolis to play a team from the big city. Most of the small-town boys have never been to a city, and the stadium in Indianapolis is huge. I moved away from my chair and drew closer to the men. At one point, the coach, played by Gene Hackman, realizes the boys on the team are intimidated by the size of the stadium and the fact that they will be playing on the big stage in front of thousands of people. Hackman grabs one of the players and hands him a tape measure. Measure the height of the basket, he tells the player. Reeling out the tape measure, the player announces, 10 feet. Hackman grabs another player and tells him to pace off the length of the court. The player does so and tells Hackman that it's 94 feet. Some in the audience were starting to get my point. Hackman tells his team that the court is exactly the size of the court at home, that the basket is exactly the height of the one at home. Now heads were nodding. Gentlemen, I said, each of you has done hundreds of missions just like this one. This mission is no different. The court is exactly like the one you've played on for the past 10 years. There is no need to do anything differently. Just play your game like you always have, and we will be successful.
And the rest, as they say, is history. And this man made history. Questions? Any questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Question about the endless wars. There's some who say there is a through line between the end of the draft and our tolerance or indifference to these endless wars, Afghanistan. Do you think we need to bring back the draft, and is there a connection? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question about whether or not when we ended the war and we became an all-volunteer force, whether this kind of encourages us to have these endless wars. I don't know if that's the case necessarily. I do think some sort of national service would be good for the country. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to come in the military. But I do think it's important for people that are citizens of this country to recognize how important that is to be a citizen, to serve as teachers or doctors or lawyers. So I would encourage some sort of national service, but I don't know whether or not it's a direct link to the endless wars. Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, thank you for your books and most of all
pleasure.
for your service. I have two questions related to the following statement. As I understand it, you refused to put your hat in the ring for the presidential nomination. Two questions. First of all, why? And secondly, is it too late to reconsider?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've told folks that I'm not one that likes politics. I'm probably a little too plain-spoken to be a good politician. But the other part is I do like policy. And I've often said that if the right administration gets in and somebody is looking for someone to help on the policy side, that I'd be interested. But politics, I just don't know that I would fare very well.
Admiral, thank you very much for coming today, first of all. Secondly, you mentioned that there's a unique bond that gets formed on a Navy team, SEAL team, and that's a critical aspect to its functioning and something that creates a family outside of your own family, and many of us have heard about that, and it's something that I'm sure is incredible to experience. How does that affect the ability to then create discipline within that? Like, for example, you mentioned the Chief Gallagher case. It occurred to me that when I was reading about that, there seemed to be a tension between the hierarchy and protecting your family and never being disloyal to your family, especially with the chief. And how do you reconcile those two things? Obviously, that bonding is necessary for the incredible things that the Navy SEALs do, but it creates a tension when something goes wrong.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's one of the things that Admiral Green is struggling with right now. You have to have that relationship. You have to have that bond at the lowest possible level. But the one thing that we try to emphasize is every member, officer and enlisted, raises their hand and says, I support the Constitution of the United States. That is where our allegiance is. It is not to the chief petty officer, the first class petty officer, or the sergeant, or the major. It is to the Constitution of the United States. That is sometimes hard to wrap your head around when you're a young 19-year-old SEAL. But the fact of the matter is they have to understand that our obligation is to the American people. And if we violate that obligation, if we somehow are not loyal to that obligation, then our loyalties are misguided. But again, it is challenging because in combat, you're not thinking about the American people, you're not thinking about the Constitution, you're thinking about the man or woman on your right and left. It is part of our leadership challenge that clearly we have not addressed very well in the last couple of years.
We'll take only the people standing because we're almost out of time.
Admiral McRaven, if I could also go back to the letter from Admiral Green.
Yep.
I think he said something along the lines of there's a good order and discipline
Right.
problem, but he didn't go so far to say that there's a cultural problem
Yep.
within the SEAL teams. Would you agree with that assessment? And also, did you see at all the beginnings of these problems forming in your time as the leader of Special Operations?
Yeah, so the question was, is it a good order and discipline problem or is it a cultural problem? I think the way Admiral Green phrased it was he doesn't know yet. Right. And I think that's an important one. I mean, he's going to obviously turn over every rock to find out, is this systemic or is this just, a couple of guys that didn't do well? It remains to be seen. Did I see it? Absolutely. When you're in combat and you've got guys going out on ops every single night, killing people, again, it is, you got to kind of rip off some of the glory behind it and realize that war is brutal. And so I'm asking great young men like yourself to be a star back home, be great, and then the next day I want you to put on your gear and go out and kill a couple people, and then kind of go back into the barracks and be completely unaffected by that. You can't do that. So the question is, how do you manage that as best you can in combat? And that is always a challenge for a leader. It's why we need great leaders. But the way you do it is through good order and discipline, making sure the guys understand what those red lines are, making sure what the expectations are.
My timekeeper tells me we're done. One more, and then I'm sorry, folks.
Admiral, thank you for being here today,
pleasure.
and thank you for your service. I noticed the Naval Academy T-shirt on that gentleman. My son graduated from the Academy in 2018. I taught there this year. The students at the Academy are in a constant state of sleep deprivation. We've had several high-profile collisions at sea. Professional sports teams are getting with the program and spending much more attention on resources devoted to better sleep, professional athletes. Is the Navy doing anything to ensure that our officers and enlisted men are getting enough rest?
Yeah, it's actually a fabulous question. And so the challenge, of course, is, when you're overseas in combat or when you're on a ship, sometimes you find yourself getting 4 hours sleep a night. And the last time, when I took over as a 3-star, I told my troops, I said, I am getting 6 hours sleep a night, period. So unless we are in the middle of a hot firefighter, unless something's going on, I'm leaving the JOC, the Joint Operations Center, I'm leaving it at night, and I'm going to get 6 hours sleep. Now, I know the manly thing to do would be to stay up all night long and just go, go, go. But what I learned a long time ago was without sleep, you're making bad decisions. As we say now, sleep is a weapon. People understand the value of sleep, but it is sometimes hard when you got these young, hard-charging men and women that want to do their best. You again, back to the leader, back to the good order and discipline. No, I'm sorry. Get some rest. If not, you're going to be making bad decisions.
Martha's Vineyard, please buy this book. It's a wonderful book.
Before you go, I'd like to end